continuing page 52. From 1928 on, it was time to call to a reckoning those late stragglers after the bourgeoisie, the NEP meant. The usual practice was to impose on them ever-increasing and finally totally intolerable taxes. At a certain point they could no longer pay. They were immediately arrested for bankruptcy and their property was confiscated. Small tradesmen, such as barbers, tailors, even those who repaired premise stoves, were only deprived of their licenses to ply their trade. There was an economic purpose to the development of the NEP wave. The state needed property and gold, and there was as yet no koloma. The famous gold fever began at the end of 1929. Only the fever gripped not those looking for gold, but those from whom it was being shaken loose. The particular feature of this new gold wave was that the GPU was not actually accusing these rabbits of anything. It was perfectly willing not to send them all off to the Gulag country, but wished only to take away their gold by main force. So the prisons were packed. The interrogators were worn to a frazzle, but the transit prisons, prisoner transports, and camps received only relatively minor reinforcements. Who was arrested in the gold wave? All those who, at one time or another, 15 years before, had had a private business and had been involved in retail trade, had earned wages at a craft, or could have, according to GPU deductions, hoarded gold. But it so happened that they often had no gold. They had put their money into real estate or securities which had melted away or been taken away in the revolution, and nothing remained. They had high hopes, of course, in arresting dental technicians, jewelers, and watch repairmen. Through denunciations, one could learn about gold in the most unexpected places. A veteran lathe worker had somewhere gotten a hold of and held on to 60 gold 5-ruble pieces from Tsarist times. The famous Siberian partisan Muravyev had come to Odessa, bringing with him a small bag full of gold. The Petersburg Tatar draymen all had gold hidden away. Whether or not these things were so could be discovered only inside prison walls. Nothing, neither proletarian origin nor revolutionary services, served as a defense against a gold denunciation. All were arrested. All were crammed into GPU cells in numbers no one had considered possible up till then. But that was all to the good. They would cough it up all the sooner. It even reached a point of such confusion that men and women were imprisoned in the same cells and used the same latrine bucket in each other's presence. Who cares about those niceties? Give up your gold, vipers. The interrogators did not write up charge sheets because no one needed their papers, and whether or not a sentence would be pasted on was of very little interest. Only one thing was important: give up your gold, viper. The state needs gold and you don't. The interrogators had neither voice nor strength left to threaten and torture. They had one universal method: feed the prisoner nothing but salty food and give them no water. Whoever coughed up gold got water. 1 gold piece for 1 cup of fresh water. People perished for gold medal. This wave was distinguished from those that preceded it and followed it, because even though fewer than half its victims held their fate in their own hands, some did. If you in fact had no gold, then your situation was hopeless. You would be beaten, burned, tortured, and steamed to the point of death or until they finally came to believe you. But if you had gold, you could determine the extent of your torture, the limits of your endurance, and your own fate. Psychologically, the situation was Incidentally, not easier, but more difficult, because if you made an error, you would always be ridden by a guilty conscience. Of course, anyone who had already mastered the rules of the institution would yield and give up his gold. That was easier. But it was a mistake to give it up too readily. They would refuse to believe you had coughed it all up, and they would continue to hold you. But you'd be wrong, too, if you waited too long before yielding. You'd end up kicking the bucket, or they'd paste a term on you out of meanness. One of the Tatar draymen endured all the tortures. He had no gold. They imprisoned his wife, too, and tortured her. But the Tatar stuck to his story, no gold. Then they arrested his daughter. The Tatar couldn't take it anymore. He coughed up 100,000 rubles. At this point, they let his family go, but slapped a prison term on him. The crudest detective stories and operas about brigands were played out in real life and on a vast national scale. The introduction of the passport system on the threshold of the 30s also provided the camps with a good-sized draft of reinforcements. Just as Peter I simplified the social structure, sweeping clean all the nooks and crannies of the old Russian class system, our socialist passport system swept out, in particular, the betwixt and between insects. It hit at the clever, homeless portion of the population, which wasn't tied down to anything. In the early stages, people made many mistakes with those passports, and those not registered at their places of residence, and those not registered as having left their former places of residence, were raked into the archipelago, if only for a single year. And so the waves foamed and rolled, but over them all, in 1929-30, billowed and gushed the multi-million wave of dispossessed kulaks. It was immeasurably large, and it could certainly not have been housed in even the highly developed network of Soviet interrogation prisons, which in any case were packed full by the gold wave. Instead, it bypassed the prisons, going directly to the transit prisons and camps, onto prisoner transports into the Gulag country. In sheer size, its non-recurring tidal wave, it was an ocean, swelled beyond the bounds of anything the penal system of even an immense state can permit itself. There was nothing to be compared with it in all Russian history. It was the forced resettlement of a whole people, an ethnic catastrophe, but yet so cleverly were the channels of the GPU Gulag organized. The cities would have noticed nothing, and they had not been stricken by a strange 3-year famine, a famine that came and went, that came about without drought and without war. This wave was also distinct from all those which preceded it, because no one fussed about with taking the head of the family first and then working out what to do with the rest of the family. On the contrary, in this wave they burned out whole nests, whole families from the start, and they watched jealously to be sure that none of the children, 14, 10, even 6-year-olds, got away. To the last scrapings, it all had to go down the same road, to the same common destruction. This was the first such experiment, at least in modern history. It was subsequently repeated by Hitler with the Jews, and again by Stalin with the nationalities which were disloyal to him or suspected by him. This wave included only pathetically few of those kulaks for whom it was named, in order to draw the wool over people's eyes. In Russian, kulak is a miserably dishonest rural trader who grows rich not by his own labor, but through someone else's, through usury, and operating as a middleman. In every locality, even before the revolution, such kulaks could be numbered on one's fingers, and the revolution totally destroyed their basis of activity. Subsequently, after 1917, by a transfer of meaning, the name kulak became applied in official and propaganda literature once it moved into general usage to all those who in any way hired workers, even if it was only when they were temporarily short of working hands in their own families. And we must keep in mind that after the revolution it was impossible to pay less than a fair wage for all such labor. The committees of the poor and the village Soviets looked after the interests of landless laborers. Just let someone try and swindle a landless laborer. To this very day, in fact, the hiring of labor at a fair wage is permitted in the Soviet Union. But the inflation of the scathing term kulak proceeded relentlessly, and by 1930, all strong peasants in general were being so-called all peasants strong in management, strong in work, or even strong merely in convictions. The term kulak was used to smash the strength of the peasantry. Let us remember, let us open our eyes. Only a dozen years had passed since the great decree on the land. That very decree, without which the peasants would have refused to follow the Bolsheviks, and without which the October Revolution would have failed. The land was allocated in accordance with the number of mouths per family equally. It had been only 9 years since the men of the peasantry had returned from the Red Army and rushed onto the land they had wrested for themselves. Then suddenly there were kulaks, and then there were poor peasants. How could that be? Sometimes it was the result of differences in initial stock and equipment. Sometimes it may have resulted from luck in the mixture of the family. But wasn't it most often a matter of hard work and persistence? And now these peasants, whose bread grain had fed Russia in 1928, were hastily uprooted by local good-for-nothings and city people sent in from the outside, like raging beasts, abandoning every concept of humanity, abandoning all humane principles which had evolved through the millennia. They began to round up the very best farmers in their families and to drive them, stripped of their possessions, naked into the northern wastes, into the tundra and the taiga. Such a mass movement could not help but develop subsequent ramifications. It became necessary to rid the villages also of those peasants who had merely manifested an aversion to joining the collective farms, or an absence of inclination for the collective life which they had never seen with their own eyes, about which they knew nothing, and which they suspected. We now know how well founded their suspicions were, would mean a life of forced labor and famine under the leadership of loafers. Then it was also necessary to get rid of those peasants, some of them not at all prosperous, who were, because of their daring, their physical strength, their determination, their outspokenness at meetings, and their love of justice, were favorites with their fellow villagers, and by virtue of their independence were very dangerous to the leadership of the collective farm. Beyond this, in every village, there were people who in one way or another had personally gotten in the way of the local activists. This was a perfect time to settle accounts with them: jealousy, envy, insult. A new word was needed for all these new victims as a class, and it was born. By this time it had no social or economic content whatsoever, but it had a marvelous sound: podkulakchnik, a person aiding the kulak. In other words, I consider you an accomplice of the enemy, and that finishes you. The most tattered landless laborer in the countryside could quite easily be labeled a podkulakchnik. And so it was these two terms embraced everything that constituted the essence of the village: its energy, its keenness of wit, its love of hard work, its resistance, and its conscience. They were torn up by the roots, and collectivization was accomplished. but new waves rolled from the collectivized villages. One of them was a wave of agricultural records. Everywhere they began to discover record agronomists who up until that year had worked honestly all their lives, but who now purposely sowed seeds in Russian fields on the instructions, of course, of the Moscow Institute, which had now been totally exposed. Indeed, there were those same 200,000 unarrested members of the Working Peasants' Party, the TKP. Certain agronomists failed to put into effect the profound instructions of Lysenko, and in one such wave in 1931, Lork, the so-called king of the potato, was sent to Kazakhstan. Others carried out the Lysenko directives too precisely and thus exposed their absurdity. In 1934, Tikhov agronomists sowed flax on the snow, exactly as Lysenko had ordered. The seeds swelled up, grew moldy, and died. The big fields lay empty for a year. Lysenko could not say that the snow was a kulak or that he himself was an ass. He accused the agronomists of being kulaks and of distorting his technology, and the agronomists went off to Siberia. Beyond all this, almost every machine and tractor station wrecking in the repairs of the tractors was discovered. And this is how the failures of the first collective farm years were explained. It was a wave for harvest losses in comparison with arbitrary harvest figures announced the preceding spring by the Commission for Determination of the Harvest. There was a wave for failure to fulfill obligations undertaken for delivery to the state of bread grains. The district party committee had undertaken the obligation and the collective farm had not fulfilled it. Go to prison. There was a wave for snipping ears, the nighttime snipping of individual ears of grain in the field, a totally new type of agricultural activity, a new type of harvesting. The wave of those caught doing this was not small. It included many tens of thousands of peasants, many of them not even adults, but boys, girls, and small children, whose elders had sent them out at night to snip because they had no hope of receiving anything from the collective farm for their daytime labor. For this bitter and not very productive occupation, an extreme of poverty to which the peasants had not been driven even in serfdom, the courts handed out a full measure, 10 years for what ranked as especially dangerous theft of socialist property under the notorious law of August 7, 1932, which in prisoners' lingo was known simply as the Law of 7/8. This Law of 7/8 produced another big, separate wave from the construction projects of the first and second 5-year plans. From transport, trade, and industry, big thefts were turned over to the NKVD. This wave must further be kept in mind as one that kept on flowing steadily for 15 years until 1947, especially during the war years. Then in 1947, the original law was expanded and made more harsh. Now at last we can catch our breath. Now at last all the mass waves have come to an end, Comrade Molotov said on May 17, 1933. We do not seek our task as being mass repressions, who at last begone nighttime fears. But what's that dog howling out there? Go get him, go get him. And here we are. The Kirov wave from Leningrad has begun. While it lasted, the tension was acknowledged to be so great that special staffs of the NKVD were set up in each and every district executive committee of the city, and an accelerated judicial procedure was introduced. Even earlier, it had not been famous for being slow, and there was no right to appeal. There had been no appeal earlier. It was also believed that 1/4 of Leningrad was purged, cleaned out in 1934 or 35. Let this estimate be disproved by those who have the exact statistics and are willing to publish them. To be sure, this wave took in much more than Leningrad alone. It had a substantial impact on the rest of the country in the form that was consistent, though chaotic. The firing from the civil service of all those who still left there, whose fathers had been priests, all former noblewomen, and all persons having relatives abroad. Among such lashing waves as this, certain modest, changeless wavelets always got lost. They were little heard of, but they too kept flowing on and on. There were Schutzbundlers who had lost the class battles in Vienna and had come to the fatherland of the world proletariat for refuge. There were Esperantists, a harmful group which Stalin undertook to smoke out during the years when Hitler was doing the same thing. There were the unliquidated remnants of the Free Philosophical Society, illegal philosophical circles. There were teachers who disagreed with the advanced laboratory team system of instruction. In 1933, for instance, Natalia Bugayenko was arrested by the Rostov GPU, but in the third month of her interrogation, a government decree suddenly announced that the system was a faulty one, and she was let go. There were employees of the political Red Cross, which through the efforts of Ekaterina Peshkova was still defending its existence. There were mountain tribes at the north of the Northern Caucasus who were arrested for their 1935 revolt, and non-Russian nationalities kept rolling in from one area, then another. On the Volga Canal construction site, newspapers were published in 4 national languages: Tatar, Turkish, Uzbek, and Kazakh, and of course there were readers to read them. There were once again believers who this time were unwilling to work Sundays. They had introduced the 5- and 6-day week, and there were collective farmers sent up for sabotage because they refused to work on religious feast days, as had been their custom in the era of individual farms. As always, there were those who refused to become NKVD informers. Among them were priests, those who refused to violate the secrecy of the confessional for the organs had very quickly discovered how useful it was to learn the content of confessions, the only use they found for religion. And members of non-Orthodox sects who were arrested on an even wider scale. And the big solitaire game with the socialists went on and on. And last of all, there was a category I have not yet named, a wave that was continually flowing. Section 10, also known as KRA, Counter-Revolutionary Agitation, and also known as ASA, Anti-Soviet Agitation. The wave of Section 10 was perhaps the most constant of all. It never stopped, and wherever there was another big wave, as for instance in 1937, 45, and 49, its waters became particularly swollen. Thank you for listening. Have a good day.